actually have the hardest job today, which is following Gil. Any of us who came up after Gil's passionate speech will find ourselves struggling to put as much content in 19 minutes. Let me say that I have really the best job in the world, because my job is to help people visualize things before they happen. That's what we as planners and urban designers and architects and engineers and landscape architects and developers do. We imagine the place we have and how it might be changed into the place we would rather have. And that is the fundamental act that is behind the story of placemaking. Now, I learned visualizing change before it occurs is a lot easier when you explain it in terms that draw upon people's desire rather than their rational intellect, which is why we show a lot of pictures. A long time ago, I used to think when we started that I could sit down with a private property developer or a mayor and say, we have these really important social, cultural, and environmental objectives to achieve. Don't you think this would be worthwhile, worth doing? I learned later that it was a lot better to say, how would you like to make more money or get more votes and do it faster and be the good guy instead of the bad guy and spend less to do it? And then they look up and they say, how do I do that? How do I do that? And I say, because first we have to achieve these social, cultural, and environmental objectives, and this is how we do it. Now, once upon the biggest moment for me in planning that convinced me that this was the right kind of work to do was when I was needling the planning director of a large North American city, asking him questions and so on. And finally, he turned to me in frustration and said, Victor, we can't plan yet. We don't know what's going to happen. Exactly. Exactly. That is why we have to visualize change before it occurs. And the most important place to do this visualization together is in the public spaces. And the most important public spaces are the streets, while they're all important. So in our practice, we are in the before and after business. We have to help people inherit something, usually a brittle and coarse, economically moribund landscape in many cases, and imagine how to change it into something finer grained and something more sustainable and doable. We have to make pictures of the place that doesn't yet exist. So sometimes we are doing that by squinting at the place half done and imagining what we would change about it to bring about the next generation of timely upgrades. And that's what I mean when I say visualizing change before it occurs. Now, in most of the world, especially in the developed countries and in those that have been beset by a long, drawn-out sprawl era, we have to restore their confidence that building makes things better rather than worse. We have to reignite their belief in the idea that putting one brick on top of another and changing the place will actually improve it instead of degrading it or being in some sort of downward trade. And that's why we draw, because drawing helps you break loose of the constraints of the existing condition and imagine change that makes things better. Now, why is this significant right now? Well, for all the reasons you've heard this morning. If we can make good compact cities, we can do a lot of important things like drive less and in the process heal the planet, save the planet, burn calories instead of oil, and make people happier. Okay, worth doing. The most important thing to explain to the audiences is that we're not just doing it because it looks better, but we're doing it because it makes it more valuable. And the value that we generate by putting the brick on top of another artfully, instead of just putting it there, will add to the property value, it will add to the tax revenues that make things go. So if they need a new fire truck, the mayor will have the revenue to make that new fire truck. If the investor needs to prove return, he'll have the return to do that. We have to add value. We have to do it in ways that are less expensive, not more expensive than the conventional practice. Now, how do we add value? It is this basic. We have to make places where people want to be. And as we travel around, we went on this great mission over the past couple of decades looking for places that achieve what I just described. And it's absolutely consistent. If you make the places where people want to be, then they will show up there instead of other places. And they will choose that place, and they will pay to be there. And that will make things go. Those places where people want to be have certain characteristics in common that seems to transcend climates and cultures and continents. They are very consistent despite their variations. And it is also increasingly easy to contrast those traditional places that succeed generation after generation with those places that do not, that disappoint immediately upon their construction. These are both pictures from the Republic of Panama, and yet they describe two wholly different ways to build the city. One that looks like a city built as if human beings are to be supported in that habitat, and the other that looks like auto habitat, car place. So when we hold up the camera and we look through the lens, we're actually trying to look through 3 or 4 kinds of lenses simultaneously. The most important ones are probably here. The middle column describes the things we all are expected to do as good stewards of the resources. We think like engineers about making sure that the water flows in the pipe and the light changes from green to red when you want people to stop and that kind of thing. And that's the efficient engineering, practical mind about how to make the city. Incredibly important. And usually the only lens that's used. There are at least two other lenses that are very important. On the left, the lens of thinking of it like a wildlife ecologist thinks of wildlife habitat. Human beings are a very picky species with a lot of subspecies among us of our wildly varying households and institutions and companies and so on. And we need different habitats for those, places where we can nurture our young and secure our future. And then there's this third lens, the one that almost never gets any attention except in few magazines or in esoteric discussions late at night in schools of architecture, and that is thinking of the city as a great collective work of art, in which by aligning that street this way instead of that way, we can create an effect that resonates inside our souls and makes us want to be in that place. Wait, that was the goal, the place where people want to be. That's the one without which we can't make sustainable cities. So my friend John Massengale and I went on a long journey recently to produce a book on street design, and after 3 years of traveling around and shooting 18,000 pictures and measuring a bunch of streets and again staying up late at night and arguing about what seems to matter the most, we eventually came to the conclusion that this was the one thing that mattered the most because the streets last so long, longer than the buildings, longer than the uses on the land. The alignment of that street will last. When you draw lines on a map, they resonate for centuries in that place. And so that's why we say it's the secret to great cities and towns. We produced this big fat book which talks about the concept, and I'm happy to show you some of the images that are in the book that Femi mentioned today. The places where people want to be don't look the same when we take a photograph of one from Guatemala or another one from Sweden. We get a very different kind of thing, and yet we can tell that it's the geometric act, the act of drawing lines on a map, the act of deciding that the trees should align or not align, that end up forming our inheritance in that place. Imagine this fellow here who commutes at 0 degrees Fahrenheit some days of the year, and yet his commute is absolutely spectacular because someone was willing to draw lines on a map and plant those trees in a row, applying what Robert Stern called the first rule of design, line things up. Not bad, right? And because they did that very simple thing, this is the gift he receives every time he gets on his bike to go to work. Or consider this gift from the early 20th century, drawn by the great town planner John Nolan. Said, someday when they share the road here, they'll be having the effect of passing through a climax forest with the trees arching overhead like the roof of the cathedral. And they'll only get that effect if they plant native trees and they plant them thoughtfully. So actually the Design Act determines whether we create public spaces where people want to go roost and perform their rituals. The ritual of the New York Marathon. It's hard to imagine that happening without the streets of New York as their backdrop. It wouldn't be the same thing. It's how we create places where people want to communicate with one another, including selling each other things. And we see that everywhere we go. It's also how we create convenient conveyance of ourselves and our goods and our ideas from one place to another. Yes, it is that. And sometimes we do it in cars, and sometimes we do it in buses and trains and streetcars and ferries. Sometimes we do it on 2 wheels, sometimes on 1 wheel, and sometimes on 2 feet. But because we draw it, it turns out to be a place that people are drawn to. Now, there is this other world as well. I just described you a species that was incredibly good at making those kind of places and then got incredibly bad at it very suddenly. It's like a historical tipping point, not just on the commercialized street, but on the average residential street here in the borderland. And we used to be good, not very long ago, at mixing people and public transportation and their vehicles and their buildings and making addresses, not just routes from one place to another. And then we got bad at it. So as a species, we're actually recovering our techniques. We're dredging back up the ancient dusty books of how to do this, and we're studying the historic places again and measuring them and attempting to make new ones that don't have to be built this way. This is the picture of unsustainability from my town. I live in Miami. This was, of course, the ultimate outcome of assuming every trip would be taken by car every time, every day. It was only possible to do that if you continually metastasized the transportation system and disfigured the landscape with more and more of this. And so as we travel, we actually can step a few feet from one place to another and see these 2 worlds. One world that worked very, very well for people on 2 feet or 2 wheels, and gave us that feeling of positive, instinctive response to the habitat as public space. We take a few steps, we see the busy version with the activity of a bustling city, and there's a thrill that goes with being in public space, not just a convenience. And a few more steps, and we see the same landscape disfiguring, the same transportation system metastasizing. And we have to ask ourselves, is that the world we want to build? Now, simultaneous with the rapid carization, I don't accept rapid urbanization as this big threat. It's the rapid carization that is the problem. But simultaneous with that, we have a whole new generation of occupants in our cities that are demanding the use of the public space, whether the car users are ready for it or not. They are just simply going back out there and saying, here we come, we want to be there. We even have transportation officials, like the one in New York who recently, in the middle of the night, came out with planters and boulders and some paint and some movable chairs and tables and used the power of the office for people rather than cars and took back that space. The next morning, New Yorkers streamed out of their buildings and into those movable tables and chairs and knew exactly what to do. No surprise. Resilient species that we are. The places where people want to be, whether you're in Australia or in North America or somewhere else, have these characteristic draws. They draw upon our emotions. This a decision here to install a transportation infrastructure facility. Wait, no, you would never describe St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans as installing infrastructure. You would describe it as the making of a great street that also happens to have a streetcar. So I'm going to argue with you that real sustainability requires more than the numbers. It requires that instinctive draw. It requires beauty, at least eventually, after we fail at everything else. And here's why. Because desire drives our choices about what to spend money on, our choices about who to vote for. What we desire is going to make us decide what we're doing. And real estate choices, like political choices, are 80% emotional. If we don't touch that instinctive response to good place, then we're not taking advantage of what Daniel Burnham said about value. No one ever created a commodity as valuable as beauty, and no one ever will. You don't have to be in the West to see that. You can see that in the East. You don't have to be on 4 wheels or 2 feet. You can see it on 2 wheels. In fact, as we study cities that are ahead of our North American cities, at reintroducing bicycle transportation in a serious way, I think we can learn an awful lot. We struggle with the concept in America now of complete streets. Well, the streets feels very complete in this scene in Amsterdam. Not so complete for this fellow and his girlfriend who are thinking of going out on a street in Tennessee. And so it's worth looking at what complete streets really are like. Streets that support multimodal transportation choices. They don't look like this. They don't have big stripes of green paint to indicate this lane has been specialized for this user and that lane has been specialized for another one. What do you think? Is this a complete street? No, that's because it's ugly. So you can't have a complete street unless it's a beautiful street. That's my belief. And in fact, uglying up the city by making it more like a highway with more signs and more reflectors and more paint and more ugly white plastic sticks is not the way to do it. The way to make a place complete is with more beauty, not less. Consider here how they put a thing in the middle of the road in Seven Dials, and here how they put a thing in the middle of the road in the latest roundabout designs. We have 5 things we always look for in the street designs that do resonate. 1, they always have a shape like a public room. It's 3-dimensional, right? You've heard that from Urban Design 101. It always has walls and a floor. They always feel adapted to climate because they might have the trees in the temperate zones that let the sun in the wintertime and filter it out in the summer. They might have the extensions of architecture, but they never, ever look like this. Okay? 3rd, they go somewhere. They're natural paths between our origins and destinations. I was thrilled to hear you this morning describe connectivity as the most important feature. I absolutely agree. In fact, if we study that intersection density, comparing the suburbs or the modern suburbs and the historical cities, we have a long way to go. And what are the benefits? Well, we always talk about how we can lower CO2 emissions if we just mix land uses and build at higher densities. But what about connecting the streets? At a certain point, when we connect the streets, our carbon footprint plummets. 4th, they have to be safe. That means they have to be slower. It's as simple as that. We can't assume that the spaces where people want to be are going to, and especially pedestrians and cyclists, are going to be places where we can drive as fast as we want. This little diagram shows the difference in your cone of vision from going 30 miles an hour at the bottom to 15 miles an hour at the top. Which one do you think is going to give you more of an opportunity to notice that someone has stepped out into the street and you need to stop? And in which circumstance do you think you're more likely to kill that pedestrian if you do accidentally hit them? Well, here's a hint. A tiny little increase in speed makes a tremendous difference in an increase in mayhem. And this is the hardest one. The places where people want to be are memorable. They create that feeling inside that says, I want to go back to that place day after day. I want to see that gentleman again day after day. I want to roost in that place. So as we struggle with how to change streets, the lessons are we can't just make storage and movement space for cars. We actually have to take some of that space back and make it slower. I think one of the best retrofits we've ever found is in London on Kensington High Street. Before and after, they didn't have the end of the world traffic-wise. Look what they created. As we keep traveling, we try to add all the time to the inventory of visual evidence about this habitat idea, the place where people want to be. And so if you have pictures that you want to add to them, hashtag Street of the Day and add to the collection. But don't put one up every day. We put them up every once in a while. Thank you very much.